Hi, I'm Wojtek Gwiazda. I'm the spokesperson of the RCI Action Committee. And today we're joined by David Rovinsky, who's an American academic, very interested in Canadian issues. And we got in touch because of our campaign to protect the international mandate of Radio Canada International. And he's got a really remarkable story about how he became interested in Canadian issues. David Rovinsky, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Wojtek. It's good to be with you.
So, I said a remarkable story. Let's start at the beginning. You're an 11-year-old in Pennsylvania, and you get a shortwave radio. Take it from there.
Yeah, it was a present I got sometime around Christmas. It was just a portable radio, nothing particular about it. I just noticed the band SW, and I asked my father about that, and he said, "Oh, what? That's shortwave. It gets broadcast from other countries." Radio from other countries, you can do that? And so I turned it on, started going up and down the dial, and it turns out in the northeastern U.S., especially in Pennsylvania, it lined up well with Sackville, New Brunswick, where RCI's transmitters were sadly located. And one of the first stations I picked up was a Radio Canada International. And it turns out the very night that I found RCI was the night that Joe Clark's government had its budget defeated in the House of Commons, and the government had to resign and call an election. The election that brought Pierre Trudeau back to power. So one of my first experiences with RCI was listening to RCI explain what all of this meant, why the budget being defeated could lead to an election that was something like 9 months after the previous election. And I, as an American kid, I was simply enraptured by this. It was completely different from anything I was used to from my own politics. And when I realized the program would be there every evening, I went back every evening, listened to the election campaign, finally the election that returned Trudeau and the Liberals to power. And that was just a couple of months after that the Quebec referendum took place, the first one. And listening to the campaign and learning about the whole story of the Quebec sovereignty movement and how that grew out of the Quiet Revolution over the two previous decades. At that point, I was hooked. And it was just a fantastic story. I was curious. I tried to look up books in the library and understand this. And then I finally persuaded my parents for us to take a trip to Canada. But Pennsylvania is close enough to go by car. And we did a trip to Toronto, which I very much enjoyed. But what really fascinated me was Quebec, that there was a French-speaking province. In Toronto, with all the signs, there was French written everywhere, but not really spoken much in Toronto. And so instead of satisfying me with the trip to Toronto, it just made me want to go to Montreal. And once we went to Montreal, I was really fascinated. I was on that first trip that I decided I have to learn French so I can understand the whole country. RCI helped with this because usually the broadcast would switch over every half hour between English and French, and so it's constantly hearing French. It made me very aware that Canada is a bilingual country. That understanding the country. That so much of the country's important business takes place in French, that to really understand Canada, one should learn French. And so as in addition to all the books on Canada that I buy during our trips north of the border, I wanted to learn French. And I started doing that in school. And once I got to university, I went to St. Lawrence University, which is in Canton, New York, right up along the St. Lawrence River, kind of across from Brockville, Ontario, about an hour south of Ottawa. And there I was actually working with professors who also follow Canada, who were encouraging me to pursue my study. After St. Lawrence, I went to Laval University. At that point, my French had advanced far enough that I went to Laval University in Quebec City, did a master's degree in political science in French. And it was after that that I wanted to continue my education. So I went back to Johns Hopkins University in Washington. Their School of Advanced International Studies has a Canadian Studies program. And it was there that I did my my doctorate in political science. And from there, I went off into an academic career as a political scientist who was a specialist on Canada. I've also done some work as a diplomat, and I've served in a number of countries overseas. But in my true real intellectual love, my work as a political scientist, it always focused on Canada, especially Quebec, but also the relationship between the federal and provincial governments of Canada, and the relationships among Canada's regions, how it's very much a country of regions, and how Canada's politics are characterized by that regional tension, how the various regions play off against one another.
I'd like you just to explain, because I think some Canadians don't realize to what extent people outside of Canada are interested in Canada. And here you are as an 11-year-old getting fascinated by what's happening in this other country that basically you probably knew not much about. Why is it so important?
It's strange. It's often said, and I'm sorry, I'm going to talk a little bit like an academic here. Even scholars of Canadian foreign policy say Canada is something of a regional power without a region. That it has Canada has the ingredients for being a significant country on the world scene, but it always operates to an extent in the shadow of the United States, in that Canada is always thought of as a North American country, so something of a junior partner of the United States, but on the world scene, it's something of an adjunct of the United States. And that actually, I think, sells Canada short, because the differences between Canada and the United States, political, social, cultural, sometimes they're subtle, but they are very real. And it was one of the things I noticed coming across the border. The first time we crossed the border, I think we were on the 401 highway in Ontario. And the 401, the official logo on the screen, the number is 401 inside a crown. And just the symbolism, seeing different symbols, seeing a country with a different history, and an alternative North American experience, so to speak, really got my attention. It struck me that Canada had a very interesting story to tell, to the extent that I could perceive this as an 11-year-old. And it strikes me that the Canadians, perhaps some Canadians, have the idea that Canada might be interesting to other Canadians, but in the overall scheme of the world, it's not all that important. And it's probably not something a foreigner would need to take a lot of interest, and maybe interest in something like hockey or trade relations with Canada, but Canada for its own sake, as a country with a history, with a politics, with a literature. There's a belief that there may be a belief that Canada's story isn't particularly interesting for the rest of the world, and it very much is. And what struck me through, for example, the not only Radio Canada International, but also the Canadian studies programs that the Canadian government sponsor. And I believe you've already talked about this with in one of your other interviews. That in fact, when people from other countries are exposed to Canada's story, it's actually very interesting, and it's not just something that's a casual interest, but at least for someone with an academic bent, it was very seductive to the point that I wanted to make that my specialty as a political scientist.
And that's the thing. It's like there's so many reasons why Canada is interesting. You alluded to that. Like, I mean, here we are, a country beside the world's biggest superpower. And so how do we manage? And I remember when we had the cuts in 1991 and we lost most of the Eastern European countries, one of the justifications was that the Cold War was over. And yet the listeners wrote to us and said, no, we need to know how a democracy works. And so I think there's a lot of importance in the international mandate, and also importance in explaining to an external audience the realities of Canada. And that's what I think some people are forgetting. They're saying, well, the internet is there, and let's put aside the question that not everybody in the world has access to the internet. But even if their internet is there, national programs, whether it's on the CBC or other mainstream Canadian media, don't explain things in a way that an external audience can understand. And that, I think, is the importance of Radio Canada International.
Yeah, the thing that struck me about shortwave broadcasts as opposed to the internet is when I got that first shortwave radio, I kind of stumbled onto Radio Canada International by accident. I was spinning up and down the dial, and the first station I found that really came in well in Pennsylvania was RCI. And I don't think I would have just stumbled onto it by accident once all of this was on the internet. Now, of course, it was great during the early days. Sometimes listening to shortwave, the subject could come in strong, the signal could come in strongly, it could fade, there could be a lot of static. And it was great when everything went to internet streaming, because like for the first time I was listening to CBC programs and what was effectively stereo coming in over streaming, and that was great. But at the same time, I wouldn't have found it by accident. And the difference between listening to a program like The World at 6, which Radio Canada International always would have in the early evening, and the actual program later on for U.S. listeners, is that the program for U.S. listeners really put things in context, explaining, going back to the Joe Clark's government example, explaining what a confidence vote was, explaining what it meant that the Governor General was dissolving Parliament, explained that the Liberal Party had won a majority in the election and was now going to form the government. The entire issue of the Quebec referendum, why this was why it was taking place, how for an American audience, the idea of, after our Civil War, the idea of part of the country leaving is unthinkable. Whereas the very fact that it was being debated, and the fact that the federal government, Prime Minister Trudeau, the father, was so involved in the campaign because it was accepted that if the Québécois voted to leave Canada, they would leave and the rest of the country would, by and large, accept this. I know there's been arguing about the details over the years, but the basic principle was if Quebec votes to go, it will go. And that was very different from anything that we had in the United States. And even over the years, hearing a few years later, the free trade agreement. Canada had what was called the free trade election in 1988. That was always explained in a context for American audiences, who, if they heard anything about the free trade agreement, were generally hearing it through the American media with very narrow American economic interest. The programming explaining the Leech Lake Accord when it came about, that is something that an American listener, just hearing a discussion of the Leech Lake Accord on a domestic CBC broadcast for the first time, it's very difficult without any context, explaining why this matters, what the different regions of Canada were calling for, and why so many people were so vehemently opposed to it, to the extent that the accord didn't go through. Hearing a program for an audience very much makes it easier to put that in context for Canadians who don't have that frame of reference of growing up in the middle of Canada's history, in the middle of Canadian politics, where all this can be taken for granted. It was very helpful for me, at least, to get interest in Canada in the beginning. As I began to read more, I didn't always need that foreign context. I could read a Canadian book, listen to a CBC domestic broadcast, or as time went on, especially once the internet came along, read the Canadian media, Canadian newspapers. I didn't need the context, but it was certainly in the beginning, that is what got me not only interested in Canada, but appreciating some of the nuances of Canadian life, of Canadian reality, especially politics, to the extent that I could almost, if you want to call it, graduate to the domestic programming and truly understand what was going on. The other issue for me is I've already alluded to the importance of the French language. Hearing the radio RCI switch back and forth between English and French, it was like I felt I was missing out on something during the half hour that would be in French until English would come back on. And one of the things that when I first started studying French in school, one of the first signs of progress to me was when I would leave the radio on for the French broadcast, the French news, and I would realize I was starting to understand it. And even though the news stories were similar, you would hear Quebecois commentators interviewing other Quebecois officials in French, and it really felt that I was almost being led into this secret that was kept on the other side. And hearing the two kinds of coverage, and the time realizing that the English and French media emphasized different stories. They covered it in different ways, sometimes with different biases, especially during the two Quebec referenda. It was really RCI that, in a sense, the RCI broadcast told me what to look for and what was important. And then when I went into a domestic broadcast, I would understand what they were talking about because, oh yeah, the RCI program talked about this, why this matters. I remember one example was that I think it was when Pierre Trudeau retired from politics and John Turner was his successor. Turner was elected leader of the Liberal Party and immediately became prime minister without an election, which I think to a lot of Americans was, well, that's horribly undemocratic. He wasn't elected, no one chose him. But it was RCI that explained, no, in fact, Canadians don't elect the prime minister, they elect the parliament. And parliament, in effect, the majority in parliament, or sometimes, as is the case right now, the largest party in parliament, generates the government, and the leader of that party is the prime minister. So the prime minister is never elected directly outside of his own riding. It's an election through parliament. And I think RCI explained that in a way that I think would have just left me confused were I just to hear it on a CBC broadcast that assumes everyone knows how parliament works, how a government is formed, and instead of scratching my head, as I said, I'd listened to a domestic broadcast and I said, oh, okay, I see what they mean.
This is fascinating to hear it from your point of view, because this is what we were aiming at, trying to make sure that people understood what we were talking about and that they had the context of it. And the other part of what we were very concerned about is doing very honest journalism. But it's true that we are also part of an attempt for people to know about Canada around the world. And I'm not sure if you use the term, but people have used the term public diplomacy, that we are a tool, you know, even though we have an arm's length relationship with, let's say, foreign affairs of the government, at the same time, I guess this, you could call it kind of part of public diplomacy, telling the world about Canada.
It is. And I think when a lot of people hear public diplomacy, their thought is it's a government trying to sell its own policies, its own views on a certain issue, a government of one or another political stripe in any country, including Canada, trying to sell its view on a specific subject. And what always struck me about Canadian public diplomacy, especially through RCI and through the external affairs, then foreign affairs, before it became global affairs, Canadian studies programs, is it really wasn't selling a policy. It wasn't selling a political point of view. It certainly wasn't selling any of the Canadian political parties. It was just saying Canada matters. Here is what the news is in Canada. Here is information in Canada. The government's policy was not to ask anyone to endorse one or another Canadian policy, but just to accept that Canada was interesting and Canada mattered. Whichever party was in power or whichever region one was from or whatever, was simply that Canada was important and interesting. And it was certainly the message that came across to me. Now, granted, I'm not a representative reader, not a listener. Not every listener is going to listen to an RCI program and say, oh, I'm going to be a political scientist and write about Canada. But it really did convey the message that Canada was interesting and it was worthwhile, not just as a place, not just as a news broadcast to listen to, but for example, a country that one could go visit. In the case of Americans listening to RCI, at least in the northern half of the country, Canada is a place that one can drive to. one probably meets Canadians in the course of a day, especially if one lives along one of the interstates. Because Canadians often drive south. The stereotypes Canadians love to go down to Florida, and so if you lived on one of the interstate highways that led to Florida, you're probably encountering Canadians. In my hometown, Pennsylvania, we'd see, especially during the summer, we would see Canadian license plates all over the place. So that we know that Canadians are our neighbors, and they come and visit pretty regularly. It's a place that we can go and visit too. And yeah, our RCI did, I think, convey, and this was the government's goal. The goal of Canadian public diplomacy was simply to project the Canada matter, and it was certainly in the moment of the apex of this policy, like the 1980s and the 1990s. I think Canadian public diplomacy really did convey this.
Often enough, when you're talking about RCI, you say was. And for you as a listener, and for us as people who worked and are working at RCI, there is a was, because we've had so many cuts over the years. When you started listening, we had a full complement of producers of a lot of languages. Our English and French sections were targeted to Europe, Africa, Asia, and the United States. When you look at what's been happening since the time that you've listened to RCI to where we are now and where we're being put on April 1st, what's your reaction?
When streaming radio stations first started becoming popular around the internet, I guess it was like late 90s, around 2000, that became really widespread. The first thought as I would listen to programming from overseas, I think shortwave radio is in trouble, because now that people can do this, at least in the wealthier countries in the United States, Western Europe, no one's going to huddle over a static shortwave radio. They're going to listen this way. And this was even before podcasts came out and one could listen on demand, as opposed to having to listen at the time that the broadcast came on. And I'll confess, one of the reasons that I if you caught me there referring to RCI in the past tense, was over time the shortwave, up until the time that they were simply abolished, RCI's broadcast, shortwave broadcast became less and less important. They became less and less frequent. At the same time, domestic radio stations, not just the CBC, but all Canadian domestic radio stations, became more available on the internet. So I'll admit, even for myself, I would look less to the shortwave broadcast or the RCI broadcast and just listen to domestic Canadian media. And and then it finally came to the moment that RCI ended its shortwave broadcast completely. And there was a certain moment of disappointment to hear RCI's broadcast disappear. And I suppose I dismiss it as thinking, well, now that the internet is here, shortwave radio is becoming obsolete. But as I thought about it some more, there are a number of international broadcasters who have become very aggressive in transmitting their programs over the internet. Deutsche Welle sticks out, that they broadcast very heavily on YouTube and other social media. They're both radio and television broadcasts in certainly German and English and in a number of other languages. And they were very aggressive in continuing their program about Germany for foreign audiences. The BBC is also very aggressive. They have the BBC News TV station. We have the BBC World Service. Is still on shortwave to a degree, but their mainstay is now getting on FM transmitters in cities around the world, in addition to broadcasting over the internet. And it does strike me, the Canadians that RCI are really the CBC and the Canadian government. Instead of adjusting to the world of the internet, they kind of gave up. They just let RCI wither. The shortwave broadcast disappeared, that there was still programming on the internet, but there became less and less of it every week until up until at the moment of the pandemic. I think it was only half an hour or an hour a week of what was single weekly
I think
program.
one of the things that you're pointing, there was less and less material, and you kind of have to step back and say, why is there less and less material? Because there are less and less people employed, because we had less and people that were there to actually put the material and to do the kinds of explanations that attracted you to Canada in the first place. Because I think one of the things that we're saying is, yes, it's really too bad about shortwave because we've lost important areas like China as listeners.
And then there's also that issue, yeah.
But if we put aside the shortwave issue, the main issue for us is the international mandate of explaining to an external audience is the important thing. And whether it's a podcast, streaming, and I've joked in the past, carrier pigeon, whatever means. But once you have that done, then all you have to do is just send it off, including placing it on radio stations like we used to do. But if you don't have the people, and on April 1st, we are going to have 8 employees and 1 editor, and that will be the world service of Radio Canada International. Whereas in 1990, before the 50% cut, we were about 200 people. That radically affects what you can produce. And I think, we think that this is really going to harm our capacity to be able to explain Canada to the world.
It did. I was actually living in Canada. I was in Quebec City, Laval during those 1990 cuts. And I remember they were also very severe on Radio Canada in Quebec. A lot of the regional news bureaus, regional broadcasting around Quebec was cut out. A lot more of the programming came out in French, came out of Montreal and Quebec City, and not from the regions. And that was how the discussion that I experienced primarily. But I remember even in the CBC or Radio Canada broadcast talking about that. Oh no, by the way, Radio Canada International is being shut down. And so that it's not a new story. Even back in not a new story. Even in 1990, there was this knee-jerk reaction. If CBC's budget was being cut at all, just shut RCI down. And so I think there was a belief that really didn't do much. That they thought there was no one listening or no one was influenced by it. And granted, as I said, I'm not maybe a representative case, but people were listening. People like me were listening. And it had an effect. Someone who is probably interested in international affairs anyway, because of this Canadian public diplomacy by radio, I was drawn to not just be a political scientist, but a political scientist who did work on Canada.
David Rovinsky, it's fascinating to hear things from your perspective, and we really thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the work that you and RCI have done over the years, and I hope that the CBC and the government stop and give this some thought before they shut down something that works. But I hope they realize that it's at the end of the day it works.
David Rovinsky is an American academic who specializes in Canadian issues and started listening to RCI at 11 years of age in Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wojtek.